Okay, let's see if that works. I'm going to try to record this, and again, I appreciate your patience with me as we walk through this whole process. So it's very exciting for me to do the video conferencing. I just think it's amazing that people all over the place, and I always like to do video gallery views so you can see everybody going on there. So let me just talk a little bit about myself. I've been a professional astrologer now for over 20 years. This is my sort of 20th anniversary in 2018. And, I started off initially looking around at modern and then kind of realized that traditional astrology was where I wanted to be. And so I studied that with a teacher, Hori astrology, and then the sister of Hori astrology. Hori is where you ask a question, look at the chart of the question. And so I started doing electional. Electional is when you choose times. And then I got excited about astrological magic. And at the time, 20 years ago, nobody really wanted to touch it. And but I thought, oh, this is really great. I'm going to get into astrological magic. Basically, astrological magic it's a kind of interesting hybrid because astrologers tend to sit back and watch things unfold and use the heavens to predict, whereas magicians use their will and act. And astrological magic combines those because you need to use your will and act, but you can only do it at specific times that are very carefully chosen astrologically. So it's a kind of interesting hybrid of the two sort of disciplines. And I just got I had a friend say I sort of fell down a rabbit hole. That's definitely true. So I started getting interested in the sources that we had available, like Cornelius Agrippa, who was writing in the 15th century, and then Picatrix. Now, Picatrix is a grimoire that was written about 1000 AD in Moorish Spain, originally in Arabic. It was translated to Castilian Spanish and then into Latin in 1256, the court of Alfonso the Wise. And that was kind of the primary source for European astrological magic. And that was kind of what was popular early on, was astrological magic in the Middle Ages. But the Solomonic grimoires, like the Greater Key of Solomon, the Lesser Key, became much more popular in the Renaissance, and they're still to this day much more popular than astrological magic. It appeals to magicians, and also the astrology is kind of heavy duty to learn that. So today, I think we're going to talk about planetary magic, but I thought I would give just a little bit of a background because a lot of times people say, oh, astrology is like a unified thing, like cooking. Like, well, what kind of cooking do you do? Cooking. It's like, what kind? Oh, tacos and enchiladas. Oh, you mean Tex-Mex? No, cooking. So when someone says astrology, what kind of astrology do you do? They say astrology, they're a modern astrologer. And that's a specific school. And there's a number of different schools. They all are kind of coherent. They have similar techniques and similar philosophies. And my view is that you can't just take pieces of one school and stick it into the other. It's sort of like if you have a car, and you say, okay, I'll have the best car. I'll take a Honda body, and I'll have a Mercedes transmission, and I'll stick a Fiat engine in it. And so, like, for example, with house systems or whatever, that's why I stick to the ones with my school. Not that it's any better, but it works better together. So traditional astrology is basically the astrology that's practiced in Europe between about 1100 and 1700. And it comes from Arabic astrology, which then itself came from earlier Hellenistic. It was a combination of Hellenistic, Persian, and Vedic astrology. So Chris Brennan, who's doing a lot of podcasting and teaching and everything, does Hellenistic astrology. It's amazing. It's so great to have that available. And he's doing a great job. But there's a lot of differences between Hellenistic and traditional astrology, and then between traditional and modern astrology. Modern astrology is predominantly natal or psychological astrology. Traditional astrology focuses on prediction. So each of them has their strengths and weaknesses, and each of them has the sort of things they're best at. And in fact, I've gotten really taken with psychological astrology. I do these I'm calling it a traditional psychological reading, because I'm doing a psychological reading, but then I'm using a lot of the techniques from traditional astrology, and I try to give a more balanced view, like the dark and the light as well. And the mage reading I do is like really taken off. Pretty much everyone I do a mage reading for has got a really cool chart because they're into magic and stuff. So let's talk about, I think today we're just going to focus on planetary magic. So I think that everyone's got a really good sense of the planets. When I start talking about things like fixed stars or mansion of the moon or whatever, that becomes a little bit more, difficult for people to get a handle on. But the planets are pretty, straightforward. we have, in traditional astrology, we use the 7 traditional planets. So that's the moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And so immediately, you know, you have modern astrologers saying, well, wow, the moon's not a planet, or the sun, you know, the sun is a star. What we're dealing with is what's geocentric astronomy. So in other words, we're using a type of astronomy that's looking up from, if you looked up in the sky, what would you see? Whereas modern astronomy is heliocentric. So you're not going to see what it looks like from modern astronomy unless you go out in space 20,000 miles. And it's certainly very accurate and explains how that the sun is not orbiting the Earth's orbiting the sun, and things like that. But from the standpoint of being on Earth, it does look like the sun is coming up in the east and setting in the west. So a lot of the things that use astronomy, for example, if you're going to do celestial navigation, like on a ship, or you're going to be doing surveying, they use geocentric astronomy. They're not using the heliocentric. So for them, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So the planets that comes from the Greek, I'm going to pronounce it incorrectly for sure, but the Greek planetas, which means moving. So the planets, if you look up in the sky, are moving relative to each other as they orbit. The fixed stars, for example, are called fixed because they don't move relative to each other except over a sort of a long period of time. You know, the 7 planets, people will ask, why don't you use, this used to happen to me more like maybe 15 years ago. People will always ask me, why aren't you using Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto? You have to, they're up there. And the explanation for that is sort of like, again, like almost like a language. I mean, in German, they have all these vowels with umlauts on it and stuff like that. And you know, they have different, you know, why aren't you using those? It's like, well, I can speak English with the letters, the 26 letters we have in English. I can express myself fully. I don't need those extra letters. So that's true also of traditional astrology. We use the visible planets. You can't actually see the modern planets without a telescope. And that's a full language. And there's nothing wrong with using them, and modern does. So if you're doing modern astrology, you definitely want to use the outer planets. But when you're sort of speaking traditional astrology, then you want to stick to the 7 planets. And also there's a lot of symmetry in the system that's built up. So the 7 days of the week that comes from the 7 planets. So Monday's the moon, Sunday's the sun, and they use we'll talk about that when we get to planetary hours. So you'd have to have 10 days, you have to have Uranus day and Pluto day and everything like that. Same thing with talking about the rulership of the signs. And what I'm going to do here is, I'm a little reluctant to do too much screen sharing, but let me see if I can pop up a diagram here and we can take a look at it. Actually, let me just stop at this point and see if anybody has any questions. Has any questions occurred? I want to be kind of open to questions and led by that as we go through this. Does anybody can pop up? And looks like nobody has any questions at this point, but please, you know, I'll try to stop and we'll get some questions as we're going along. Okay, let's see here. Planetary. I'm going to go to, I apologize. This is the problem with the screen sharing, is that, okay. Oh, it's not even very big. Okay, so okay, so yeah, here we go. Okay, so let's just take a look at this. And this is kind of going into why, you know, people say, well, you know, the modern astrology, Scorpio is ruled by Pluto. You know, and the modern astrology, they focus on like ruling like. So Scorpio is ruled by Pluto because Scorpio is like Pluto. And if you see this diagram here, you see at the bottom, you can see Cancer and then Leo at the bottom. And the sun rules Leo and the moon rules Cancer. And then right next to each of them, next to Leo is Virgo, which is ruled by Mercury, and next to Cancer is Gemini, also ruled by Mercury. And then next to Virgo is Libra, which is 2 signs away from the sun, which is a sextile. So that's a positive aspect, and the Venus is a benefic planet. The moon is 2 signs away from Taurus, which is also a benefic planet, also a sextile. Then the moon the Cancer rather, is 3 signs away from Aries, which is a square. Aries is ruled by Mars, a malefic planet. Same thing. And you can see there, so that's the symmetry of the traditional sign rulership, is that it follows the benefic and malefic planets and also the aspects. And so that's, again, this is incredible symmetry of our Oops. Let me see if I can get back to the meeting here. What's the problem with uh-oh. Help. Okay, there we go. I'm not going to do that screen sharing again because that was too I had a feeling that was going to be too disruptive. So, but basically that's the reason that we don't try to plug new planets and stuff into the whole system, is that it just disrupts the symmetry, and then we can't talk about it as much. So the thing that I've kind of come to in dealing with the planets is you can think of the planets as having a particular kind of energy. And so you could think of a talisman as having a certain kind of, like a battery that you charge with a certain kind of energy. And it's interesting because that's sort of a modern view. We like to think of things in energy. And also it kind of fits with the medieval and Renaissance view of natural magic. Because in the Renaissance, someone like Marsilio Ficino, who's a priest, but doing astrological magic, was under a lot of pressure because there was always a suspicion that he was dealing with demons. So they started moving towards a sort of a natural magic view of things, which is that there's sort of natural occult virtues that are found in things. And that when you do it at a particular time, astrological time, you weren't dealing with spirits or anything like that, freaky like that. It was just sort of an energy thing. So that natural magic, they were worried about demons, and we're kind of coming from a perspective of atheistic materialism. And so that's, those perspectives are kind of in common. My view is that, and it's sort of like light having a combination of either a particle or wave, because I don't think you have to pin down what it is that my view is that the spiritual exists, and that the planets, the best way for me to relate to them as personalities. So when I think about the planets, I think about a particular person having a particular personality. And that's, when I make a talisman, my sense of it is that what I'm doing is contacting that spirit, that the spirit then is embodying in the talisman. And the talisman's a bit like having a cell phone number. So it allows me to have contact with them. And so, people ask me about talismans. Do I have to wear it all the time? Do I have to wear it in the shower? Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, I don't wear my talismans all the time. Because to me, that's not necessarily how it functions, is that essentially what it's allowing me to do is contact them. So what I suggest to people is, if you want to have an increased, power from the talisman, that you do a reconsecration, that you go do an invocation of that planet, and then keep your relationship going. And that the focus of the way that I'm doing this is really on building up a strong relationship with the archangelic or angelic spirit of the planets, because that's what I'm focused on. Is Ficino is a Renaissance philosopher. He talks about chains with the planets. Sort of the whole chain of being was one of their very important concepts. But you can interact at a higher or lower level, or different ways. For example, I was talking about natural magic. That's one way to interact. The celestial magic is sort of intermediary, and then Kabbalah and things like that is a way to interface with that. So the celestial magic is a way of interfacing with these sort of chains. And you can get in touch with, I had a guy who did a lunar mansion invocation, and he was very goetic. So he did a complete full goetic invocation. And he got this spirit that proceeded to want to make a deal with him. It was like, I think, rum and tobacco for certain things. And then didn't follow through with it. And he was like, oh, the mansions are a waste of time. That's never been my experience with mansion talismans, but of course I don't approach it that way. So my sense of it is he got something associated with that mansion, but it was more of a kind of, rambunctious, I don't know if it's demonic, but it wasn't an archangelic. Those are the kind of stuff that I like to deal with. So I think that that's an interesting, and we're basically putting the skeleton, that's what we got, is the skeleton of the tradition. We've got these books, but we don't have, that I'm aware of, living lineage holders who worked with it and pass it down. And so we're kind of there's a lot of guesswork, and there's a lot of kind of intuition, but that's where I find myself pulled towards. I was talking about earlier that I feel more of a celestial priest than an astrological magician. And so my invocations of things tend to be for like asking for, sufficient sustenance, as opposed to like $15,000 or whatever. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but I just feel like more and more that these are really powerful spirits that, know what's best for me, and I'm willing to trust them as far as what they give. Now, a lot of people would say, no, you should, tell them what to do, that sort of thing. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. It's certainly very traditional, like in the Solomonic stuff. What I'm doing is a little more devotional. So it's more like a Vedic practice.
Chris, can I jump in for a sec with a question?
Sure.
So you've described yourself as, having more of a devotional practice, as I do. And also, you've also mentioned to me in the past that you view life as more fated than not, right? You
Oh,
know,
well, that's a deep question. I wouldn't say it that way, but there's
well, the
fate.
reason, okay. Well, let me just get sort of explain why I'm asking, which is that, when you work with the talisman, or when you do planetary working, would you say that how would you describe what you're doing magically? Are you trying to improve your relationship with that spirit, that planet? Are you trying to create external circumstance changes? How would you describe what you're trying to do?
The reality is incredibly complex. You're talking about fate, free will. It's both. The fate and free will are operating simultaneously. And the inside and the outside are the same.
Mhm.
So, insofar as, I mean, you can again, there's all sorts of possible interfaces. And so, when it's the question you say, when I'm doing magic, I mean, when everyone's doing magic, there's all sorts of
When
different
one
stuff
is,
going.
yeah.
That then who knows? You know what I mean? Because when one's doing magic, it's going to depend very much on your particular context. As to how you see it and how you're interacting with it. For what I'm doing, like I said, is a particular style that is congenial to me. And so what I see myself doing is, I mean, I started off being interested in external effects. And when you're talking about using spiritual, because magic is spiritual, you're talking about using spiritual means to have a physical material end is always a little bit of if you want to be rich, you should probably be a stockbroker, you know? But if you want to change your mind, right, or your thinking or your emotional stuff, it's actually, spiritual actually is highly effective for things like that. Not that you can't do material changes with it, but what you're dealing with is the spiritual underpinnings of the material reality, right? I mean, the spiritual is more real, but it's harder to make a direct, change materially with the spiritual thing. A lot of times I get people that they tried all the conventional stuff, that didn't work, so this is kind of a way of cheating, or a last ditch kind of thing. And that's probably not a very effective way of, I mean, if you want to be rich, you would, like, that's the thing. Jason Miller has some great stuff about that. He's like budgeting, get yourself a business plan and add the magic into it. And so for material change, that's going to be a good, or look at your chart, see what you're strong or weak at. If you're really weak at a particular thing, maybe that's not what you want to focus on in terms of your greatest success. But what I'm doing is I'm finding the point of, like, I'll do my I do a daily planetary invocation, not necessarily because, oh, I want a particular thing, but because I want to keep that. It's like a friend. I mean, I don't go to my friend and say, oh, what can I get out of him today? It's like, well, he's my buddy, and we do help each other out, and I have friends that I do business stuff with. And like a friend the other day was saying, oh, thanks for all those case referrals. It's great, which is wonderful, but it's more of a friendship level primarily, and then secondarily you do get these positive effects from it, but that's not the only way to fly. I mean, you can certainly have a situation where you're invoking a spirit, you bind them, you force them into a thing, you tell them to do that, and you make a deal with them, and that's totally traditional. But that's just not how I operate. And so to say what is happening, wow, I mean, that's really, there's many different ways of talking about how
Yeah,
it's
and
going
it's
on.
almost irrelevant in a way. I mean, whether it's external or internal to the magician, it doesn't really matter, right? I mean,
What's the
but
difference?
right, what's the difference? But ultimately, so when you send out talismans or, a pentacle to help someone, it does not concern you how they receive it or how they perceive the causality of it, right? It's just
Here's the thing. Agrippa talks about faith, and I would like the word trust, because faith sounds like you're being an idiot. You believe in Santa Claus kind of thing. But trust, like a physician, if you don't trust the doctor, right, they're not going to be able to heal you as effectively. And if you're an Olympic athlete and you're convinced you're going to lose, it's going to block you. So if you get a talisman and you're convinced it doesn't work, then you're blocking a certain amount of that power. But it's not as if with astrological talismans, it's entirely dependent on you, because we all have internal magical power, but if that's all you rely on, then you're missing out on, like, what you do with the talismans is you get to tap into this, what seemingly external source. You know what I mean? I mean, obviously that there's planetary spirits exist within you as well as without you, but it does kind of seem like, get Jupiter. This is this external, very powerful force that you can tap into and align yourself with. You know, and like with Venus, if you're doing Venus magic, love magic, if you become a more, because the focus tends to be how can I go out and alter the outside world to conform to me? But if you change yourself, if you become a more loving person, it's obviously going to be helpful in terms of dealing with other people too. So your question is really good because it's really complex if you start thinking about it. And what we're doing is we're modeling. You got to have a model and you have to have an interface to start acting. But you don't want to take your model as being a complete explanation of reality. And it may not even be really that accurate. You know, who knows what's going on? But if I do X and Y happens, you figure like, wow. I mean, in the Buddhist view, there is no strict causality. You have dependent thing. A happens, then B happens. But as far as the actual causality, that's kind of questionable. And I tend, when I get philosophical, that's my operating system right now, sort of a Buddhist philosophical operating system. So great. Well, we've had fun. I mean, you and I have had amazing conversations.
That's a great chat.
I appreciate your input because a lot of this is, it's nice for me to have something to jump off from, and then everyone can hear my bizarre, weird, outre views on things. So.
While I have you though, I'm gonna mute myself so I don't hog the conversation. But you do have several questions coming up on the chat window, so you might.
Oh, let me take a look at the chat. Okay, because whoops, let me see. I'll put that. Okay, chat. Let me take a look here. Okay, let me start here. How is Vedic astrology different? Okay, Vedic astrology, let's talk about that. Vedic astrology is the traditional astrology of India. And so it has a lot of common sort of philosophical views with Western traditional astrology. For example, they believe that the spiritual exists. I mean, it's very much integrated into their culture in terms of like, you can go to a Jupiter temple, you can have a Jupiter priest, you know, that sort of thing. And they have amazing mantras and rituals and all that sort of stuff that goes on. The technique is often very different, but they do the same kind of predictive astrology that we do in traditional astrology. So it's a really good system, and it certainly takes, you know, to be good at it, obviously you take a lot of time to practice and learn it. But very much a similar in terms of the philosophical approach and the kind of stuff that they do output, but the actual techniques are very different. You need to master. I don't know if I would try to combine them. I don't know much about the techniques other than that. Talisman I'm wearing. This is a seventh mansion of the moon. Mansion talismans, 28 mansions of the moon. The moon orbits the earth in about 27.5 days, 28 mansions in the Western Arabic system. And this is for all good things. So that's cool. How should one start with the daily? I think that's probably daily planetary practice. That was one of my things that I started just doing spontaneously, and it's kind of become the cornerstone of my sort of astrological, you know, celestial magician practice, is that every day I do an invocation of the planet that rules the day. And so, like I said, today is Saturday, Saturn day, so I would do an invocation of Saturn. I just light a little incense and light a candle and do the invocation. I'm not even sure if I do it the right hour. That would be nice, but it's the right day at least. And I'm doing them constantly. I've been doing it for 20 years. So that makes up for, if you do it once, you want to have a much more focused, you know, ritual in terms of the timing. And let's see, one new message. There we go. Every day. I got that. Orphic hymns, yeah. And that's talking about invocations. I had Orphic hymns online. The new translation would be awesome. And I use the Picatrix. I started shifting over. I think most of my talismans, I do the Picatrix. There's some invocations from Picatrix. So, okay, wandering around with that. Let's see if I can get back on track here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about planetary rulership, because that's a really important concept. So in the Neoplatonic and Hermetic philosophy is kind of the basis of like Picatrix and a lot of astrological magic. I mean, Hermeticism is sort of the hidden esoteric current that runs through Western civilization. And that comes from about the 1st to 3rd century AD, writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. The Corpus Hermeticum, for example, is philosophical. There's also tons of astrology, alchemy, and magic. So every time this stuff gets popular, it causes an incredible sort of cultural efflorescence. Like the Renaissance, Ficino got into it, he translated it, and it had an incredible effect on the Renaissance. And then we're having one today. I mean, that's what's going on right now, is this, I call it a Hermetic revival. And the incredible, like you guys are into magic and divination, all that sort of stuff. All this stuff is really coming from this Hermetic revival. And we're seeing in astrological magic, we've got people like Austin Coppock Alexander Cummings are doing some really great work. So it's really gotten popular. Like I was talking about, Chris Brennan is doing his stuff. There's some amazing people out there doing really cool stuff. And it's just blowing up all over the place. In that philosophy, essentially it reminds me of Taoist philosophy. You have the one, like the Tao, and it's not even a single thing, it's like everything. And it is the sort of the source of everything. And then from the one, then the Taoists, they say from the one comes the two, from the two, the three, and the three come the 10,000 things. And so because everything has come from the one, it remains connected to the one. So there's these spiritual chains of sympathy and correspondence that connect everything. And depending on how they manifest, they're connected to each other. So the celestial, level with the planets and stars is a really key part of this sort of chain of being. And everything sort of filters through the 7 planets. And that's, like I said, a good interface. So if we look at everything on Earth in the material realm, it's composed of varying levels of each of the 7 planets. And so that's the sort of rulership, as the occult virtue or the hidden powers of the planets are in everything. So, but we'll talk about planetary rulership. For example, we talk about a rose being ruled by Venus because it's beautiful and sweet smelling. And that's because we're focused on those qualities. Nevertheless, there are other planets are involved with that. So for example, the thorns of the rose are ruled by Mars, the roots by Saturn, the sap by Jupiter or Mercury. Can't remember which of those. And so each of the 7 planets is involved in everything. So when we talk about rulership, we're talking about a predominant quality. And then you can argue about, well, like for example, gold is ruled by the sun because of its color, Jupiter because it's valuable, and Saturn because it's heavy. So you could argue endlessly over which one ruled it. They all do because of their different qualities. But so every single thing can be classified in as rulership by one or more planets. So for example, I was looking today at the moon, and William Lilly was a very famous English astrologer in the 17th century. He said, okay, as far as types of people, the moon rules queens, countesses, ladies, all types of women, the common people, travelers, pilgrims, sailors, fishermen, fishmongers, brewers, letter carriers, coachmen, huntsmen, messengers, sailors, millers, drunkards, midwives, and nurses. And you can see how that sort of makes sense because women, the moon is a feminine planet. And then also fish, because the water rules Cancer. Drunkards, midwives, that sort of thing. And then talks about animals. He says, so all such beasts are the like as live in the water: frogs, otters, snails, weasel, seafowls, cuckoo, geese, night owl. So anything is going to be classified that way. It's interesting, cats. So look at cats. They talk, well, cats are ruled by the moon because their eyes, which change, just like the moon is variable, but by Saturn because they're often melancholy, also mysterious. Both of them, the moon and Saturn, are mysterious. So there's really kind of a poetic quality about it. And it's kind of cool to look at the planetary rulership list. If you look on my website on planets, then on the left-hand side of that planet page, there's a whole bunch of links and all these endless lists of different things that are ruled by the different planets. And it kind of gets you a sense of their personality too. Once you read the rulerships, you get more of a sense of how they are. Like ducks are an interesting example because we helped raise some mallard ducks. They were wild. They weren't pets. They flew off afterwards. And ducks are, as I said, ruled by the moon. And the interesting thing about them is that the ducks are not individually as smart as, say, a crow, but they're in groups and they watch each other. So they're collectively smart because once one duck learns something, then all the other ones learn it as well. So that's an interesting thing about the moon, that kind of collective quality with the common people. So that gave me a sort of sense of the moon quality of things. So that's been one of my useful things as far as relating to the planets in a talismanic way, is sort of understand their personality. And so if you do a ritual, what you can do is you can assemble things that are ruled by that planet. So for example, Picatrix talks about, like, the moon, if you're going to do a moon ritual, you would dress in white or silver clothing. And you could have maybe things like the moon rules crystal or silver. Those would be good for, like they talk about the incense burner. And then if you're making a talisman, you can also look at materials. Now I'm a little bit in the minority as far as materials. Most people are quite into them, but they're not actually professionally making talismans. So there's a list of metals for the planets, and it's not the only list. There's a lot of different ones, but the standard list that people use nowadays tends to be Saturn rules lead, Jupiter rules tin, Mars rules iron, Sun rules gold, Venus rules copper, Mercury is mercury, and the moon is silver. So problem with those a lot of those metals is you don't want to have a talisman, like a lead talisman. You don't want a lead talisman. It's soft, it'll break, it's poisonous. You don't want that. You don't want to wear it. If I sold that to people, they would be unhappy with it. Mercury, it's liquid. I don't know what you're going to do with a talisman that's liquid at room temperature. You'd have to keep it in the freezer. Tin is really flimsy. So part of it's just practical stuff in terms of what people are willing to buy. And so you could certainly make it on your own if you wanted to do tin. But again, even that metalworking stuff takes a lot of, and you don't want to be melting lead and things like that or working with mercury. So there is an astrologer named Thabitimankura, and he says, it doesn't matter what material you use, you need to be made at the right time. And I'm moved toward that direction in a lot of ways. I've been focusing on that. And then what I'll do is make sure the design is appropriate. So along with the planetary rulership of material objects, there's also things like images and mathematical proportions and numbers and sigils and planetary tables and things like that that are also related to each of the planets. And so, for example, each planet has a magic square. A magic square is numbers. You put them in a grid, and if you add them horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, they all add to the same number. So each of the 7 planets has a particular magical square. And one of the things I've been doing recently is getting back to my Sufi roots, and my jeweler's in Pakistan, and he's been making all these sort of Sufi Islamic astrological talismans from a book called the Shams al-Marif, which means the Sun of Wisdom. And they've got all this Quranic letter magic and stuff like that. So, it's been pretty cool to get back into that. But each of those things is related to the planet, in a spiritual sense. So there's a sort of the quality of the nature of the planet that relates to those symbols. And that's another way to bring the planet. So if you're making a talisman, you'd be concentrating things of that planet. Like I said, either the materials or the designs. And then to make the astrological talisman, you want to make it an astrologically appropriate moment. So for Venus, you want to have, on any planet, you want to make them as strong as possible. So we'll get in I'll just talk a little bit about its full chart stuff. If you don't do full chart, that takes a little bit of advanced astrology. But basically what you want to do is have the planet in the sign or exaltation that it rules. So like, for example, Venus is in sign in Taurus and Libra, exalted in Pisces. And you want to have them rising. So on the ascendant, or if you went outside and looked out, they'd be on the horizon, eastern horizon, or directly overhead. Those are the 2 points at which the planets are strongest. And then you want the planetary hour. And we'll talk a little bit about planetary hours. And then not afflicted. And so what you're doing is picking a moment. It's sort of like if you go to the casino and you got the spinning dials and they all come up, with a jackpot. We're getting a jackpot moment, when all these factors are at maximum strength. And that's the time where you can have the maximum power of that planet. And then at that point, we invoke the planet and say, please inhabit this talisman, and provide good or whatever. You can actually ask for specific stuff, that's fine. And that's how you make the talisman. And then what I suggest to people that they do, all our talismans, when we make them, they're consecrated when they're made. When you get it, you do an additional personal consecration. It's mostly to introduce yourself to the talisman. It's already got the power in it, so to speak. It's already got that set up, that connection. But you want to activate that self for yourself. You want to make sure that you have that connection to the planet. Okay, let me just take a look here. We've got some more questions. Hectic. Okay, exaltation versus rulership. Okay, they're pretty close. And one of the things that's on my site, I'll have these point scales. And sometimes, you can get really, like, sign is +5, exaltation is +4. You can potentially get, in some planets, you can get +8. Others, you can even get up to +10. And people get obsessed with the numbers. It's like really not, +4 and above is fine. I mean, I analogize it to talking to someone on the phone. And so if you're talking to them and you're like old landline, it's going to, to India and you can't even get through, then that's not going to work. But if you've got a cell phone, and it drops occasionally, that's okay. You can still communicate. And that's probably maybe like a, +3 or 4. But, you don't need to get a T1 line to have communication with the person. So the idea, if it's a battery, and if it's 3 versus 9, obviously 9 is way better. Don't get the 3. But that's not what I see we're doing. It's more of a way of getting a communication with it. So +4 and above will really do the job for you.
Chris, how about face rulership? It's something that we're weirdly sensitive to as tarot readers because face rulership is really prevalent in the minor arcana. They're assigned by planet and decan. So, and as I understand it, it's really quite a weak dignity, isn't it?
Depends on what you're talking about, because there are specific decan talismans. And so if you're going to make one of those, there's a way to do elections for those. And obviously then you wouldn't worry about anything else because you're trying to focus. There's 36 decade spirits. And so you're trying to focus on making, but if you're making a regular planetary talisman, the face is so weak that it's probably not, that's a, in a pinch maybe, but that's probably not a dignity that you want to be using for a standard face, standard planetary talisman. But if you're going to make a decade talisman and there's separate recipes for those, then of course you'd want to have the appropriate decade.
Okay, that makes sense. And I also have another question about dignity and strength generally. I mean, I have a sort of understanding that I've heard from other astrologers about, about how rulership is, a planet calling the shots in its own house, and how exaltation is sort of more like being an honored guest. But how would you, how do you broker the difference when there's, a less strong dignity? What kind of metaphor can you use? So for example, if, Mel and I were just talking about this morning, say, we were talking about Jupiter having face rulership in Capricorn where it's in detriment, right? Oh, sorry, in fall. And, so how does that?
What you do, it depends, because you got to recognize that it depends on what the context. So when you're talking about predictive astrology, right, it's going to be different from astrological magic in a lot of cases. And if you're talking about horary versus natal, it's going to be different. So, and if you're talking about a particular chart, it's going to be different. So it's very dangerous to talk about it in general, right? Because you're going to end up in a situation where it's not accurate. But if you're talking about, say, astrological magic or predictive astrology, and you're going to make a Jupiter talisman, you say, well, look, Jupiter's dignified by face +1, but he's in fall -4, he's -3 overall.
I see.
So, but nevertheless, it's not the same thing as plus, for example, you can have a situation where Venus is in detriment, -5 and +6, so she's +1. It's not the same as face, because that's an indication that, for example, if it signifies somebody like you're asking about, someone, marry this person, they're going to have all sorts of strong positive qualities, but all sorts of strong negative qualities, and a little bit more negative than positive. So you don't want to just reduce it to a number. That's a mistake. It gives you an initial rough idea of strength, but like retrograde is -5, combust is -5. Oh, they're the same. By no means. There's a lot more nuance involved with what those are.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I'm asking. I mean, do you have a way of thinking about it in an analog fashion in terms of, what term or phase rulership really feels like, as opposed to...
Depends on the context, because it could be strength, it could be, there's a million different things, and if you do it in general, then you lose the meaning of the individual thing. But face is like barely treading water, barely keeping your head above the water, barely hanging on. That's a typical what, for example, Lily says about face. But also it could be someone like your relationship. Well, they're not really that into it. They're like, they're really ambivalent. They're just slightly above ambivalent,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe there's all sorts of stuff going on in their life right now and they can't have a relationship. So for a talisman though, we don't need to worry about that. We're like, +1 is just too weak. You wait. You're like, well, all it is +1 right now. Or it's Jupiter's in Capricorn, so he's minus, it's overall -3. Well, I want to do it now. You got to wait. It's like gardening. You want to plant tomatoes and it's January in the Northern Hemisphere. You're not going to be able to do it. And that's one of the things the aphorisms attributed to Ptolemy say, that astrological magician's kind of like a gardener, You have to wait for the appropriate moments to come up, and then you can act. And you can have incredible, harvest, but you have to act at the right moment,
Yeah, I guess I can see that metaphor working. For example, if you're planting, you might get a nice day in April where you might think you should plant the tomatoes, but that would be a really bad idea where we live,
Right, because you're going to get a frost, and exactly. So that's what I would say too, is that the problem that it's much easier to turn a magician to an astrologer than an astrologer to a magician, because astrologers often have an aversion to acting and have an aversion. They certainly seem to have an aversion to magic until recently. It's become, astrology magic sort of exploded, but it used to be I'd go to a conference or something or give a talk and people would be like, they'd ask me about Pluto talismans and then they kind of file out because it just kind of freaked them out. It just, the whole magical stuff, it's bad enough to be doing astrology as it is, but can we be more scientific? Whereas magicians are like, yay, they just have a much more of an openness to the whole area. And The only problem they have is they sometimes don't want to wait. I've often had these discussions, very polite discussions with Jason Miller, who like wants to do Jupiter talismans whenever. And I'm like, well, hey, why don't we do a real honkin' ritual when it's a good time too? And he's like, we just sort of agree to disagree about that. But and we've been very nice. We haven't got into a flame war or anything like that. I've always been very happy with that. But I really respect him. It's just that I don't agree that you should be making Jupiter talismans when Jupiter's really afflicted. I mean, you might as well maximize all your, you know, the power that you've got is my opinion. You know, it's obviously not the only way to fly. But so let's talk a little bit about planetary hours, because that's the easiest thing for magicians, particularly if you don't use, you can either use moon phase or planetary hours. And planetary hours are really interesting because they're sort of the old style of timekeeping. And so in that, the day begins at sunrise, which sort of makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, that's when the day starts. I mean, the midnight stuff is weird. That midnight comes from the fact that in astronomical, if you look at a chart, the sun is at the descendant directly below you. That's midnight. So it's weird that the day starts in the middle of the night, but that's why that works that way. The funky thing about the planetary hours is it goes from sunrise to sunset. So that means for most of the year, the 12 hours from sunrise to sunset are not 60 minutes. They're gonna be different. And if you're in the northern hemisphere, obviously in the summertime, the days are longer than the nights. And then in the wintertime, they're gonna be shorter. So at the equinoxes is when you get the days and nights being equal. So what you do is you figure out your sunrise time and your sunset time, and you divide by 12, and that's your hours of the day. And then from sunset to sunrise in the next day. So 24 hours, they're all going to be altered, either more or less than 60 minutes for most of the time. So you need to do a calculation for your location depending on the time of the year. So, you know, pretty much, I believe this is true. Every September the 1st is going to be the same at your location, but you do need to check for your location. So the way it works is that you take the 24 hours and you do them in the Chaldean order. The Chaldean order is our standard traditional order of the planets, and that goes from fastest to slow, or rather from slowest to fastest. So Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, and then repeating. And so what happens is, as you go through that order, so if you start with, for example, the first hour of the day, sunrise on Monday is going to be moon hour. First hour on Sunday, at sunrise will be sun hour. So the planet that rules a day also is the first hour of that day. If you follow it through in the Chaldean order, 7 planets, 24 hours, then the next day, so the next day, the very last hour of Monday is going to be Jupiter hour. Okay, so the next day is Tuesday, which is Mars, is going to be Mars hour. So it's really interesting because that's where the days of the week order comes from. So the order of the days of the week comes from the planetary hours and the planetary days. It's really incredibly complicated and orderly. If you look at my website, there's a thing called the third planetary order, and I go into this whole thing with modular arithmetic and all this crazy stuff. It's like you have planetary minutes, planetary seconds, the leap years are all in these different interesting sequences and orders. There's basically 3 fundamental sequences that you can do the 7 planets in. So you can do the Chaldean order, you can do the days of the week order, or you can do this, what I call the third planetary order. And so it's either forwards or backwards for those. But it's really kind of incredible. So incredible order and precision that's displayed in these. So the planetary hours are cool because they give you a way of getting more of a focused, idea of the energy. So I've had people, in one of my courses, I'll have people say, like, look at the planetary hours and then see what you're doing at those hours. So, the hour Mercury, you might be on the phone. Mars, you might be getting into an argument. Jupiter, you might be making some money. And you can do elections based on that too. And certainly for planets, one of the most basic things to do is say, if you want to make a Jupiter talisman, make a Jupiter hour. The only problem with that is you need to watch out for Jupiter's not afflicted. So you want to make sure Jupiter's not in his detriment, his fall, combustor, or retrograde. But other than that, you can do I do my Planetary Magic mini course. We do planetary hour stuff. And that's the most basic timing. And certainly when you do full chart elections, you also want to make sure it's planetary hour. So that's one of the most, and the Greater Key of Solomon, for example, that's the timing that they use for the Pentacles is planetary hours. So that's the most prevalent magical timing, if it's astrological. And I noticed that the Greek magical papyri, which are like, they're old, they're like Roman, whatever that is, 1st to 2nd, 3rd AD, century AD. Those are also, they're using planetary hours. So it's a really ancient system. So that's kind of cool. And, that's also, again, another reason why we don't have Uranus ruling, into the planetary rulership system, because you'd have to have another day and Uranus hour and all that. It would mess up all this incredible symmetry that we've sort of discovered. First hour better than the eighth. Okay, let me something. Signing points. Detriment.
Well, astrology is literally just timing. The timing.
I don't know if it's just timing. I mean, what I would say about it is it's a system of, first of all, description of reality. And the traditional astrology aspires to a complete description of reality. And then it's a means of orientation, too. So you orient yourself, and timing is certainly a very important part of that orientation.
Well, yeah, by timing I meant like detriment, and taking into account the detriments as well as the hours, the signs. Like you do something in the hour of Jupiter during the sign of Capricorn, Sagittarius, and you would assume you have all this amazing Jupiter energy. But if it's a detriment, you got to take that into account too. So it's, timing in that respect.
Yes, certainly involves a heck of a lot of timing. Yeah, I would definitely agree about that. And that's what makes it so complicated. I mean, the number of times I've messed stuff up because I did AM for PM or daylight savings time, it's like the bane of my existence. It really is. And, I wish they'd get rid of it, because it's just, if you're going to have standardized something, you don't want to keep changing it around. And people have enough trouble figuring out what time zone they're in without I don't think, when I have people send me the birth time for a natal reading, maybe 1 out of 100 will they get the time zone right, and then to get the daylight savings time right. So I had one the other day where they had the correct. I think they said daylight savings time, and it was right, and I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. And I messed it up.
Yeah, I was born during the summer, and long enough ago that I really had to check to make sure they're using daylight saving time when I was born.
Yeah, exactly. The craziest one is like Indiana and Illinois, where they were like they couldn't make. They either did it by county, or they were like. We do standard time, but you will record it in Eastern time, and crazy stuff like that. So it just makes it, the whole point of standardizing time is to get everybody on the same page. So it does
Right.
It's a little crazy. I wish they'd quit messing with it, but it's become. I've noticed that over the past couple of years, you're starting to see a lot of articles of like, oh, we hate daylight savings time, and I'm like, yeah, finally. I mean, make it one or the other, but don't switch. But we'll see. They're not asking astrologers. If they went out and polled the magicians and astrologers, we might get a different.
They'd find someone, the person they talk to would be on the Julian calendar.
Right, exactly. let me take a look here at some of these questions. Okay, the first of the 8th hour. One of the reasons when I do talismans is I tell people to do sunrise, which is the first hour, is because it's so easy for them. People can go out and they can find that pretty simply. They can just Google sunrise at their location and they can find it. But in terms of if you know what you're doing, if you're going to do a consecration, it's perfectly fine to do it anytime that planet rules it. So it could be up to 3 times in a day. So that's perfectly fine. And there's something to be said about sunrise in terms of beginning new things. There's definitely an archetypal quality about sunrise from that. So that's useful too. But it's the planetary hour that's most important. And a lot of it is like, I'm often dealing with people that are at different levels of knowledge. Some people know a ton of stuff. Other people, this is the first time they've even done any magic. So that's why I'll typically recommend the first hour, the sunrise hour. But that's not, and there is that sunrise power. But otherwise, yeah, the other planetary hours of the planet are perfectly fine to use for that. So let's see if we had another question there's one about. Okay. So how do you determine if working with a planet is right for you, if that planet is in detriment or fall, but well aspected, like mutual reception phase? I think this person might be asking about natal charts. And so that raises an interesting issue, is that it looks like traditional Western astrology, what they did was they said, well, I need to get rich. So I'm going to go find an astrologer and get a talisman. So they go to the astrologer and say, I need a wealth talisman. The astrologist might ask them, well, you have your birth chart. Well, if you weren't a king or a nobleman or rich merchant, you probably wouldn't have your natal chart. You might know the date, but so it seems to me that the Western traditional astrology were pretty much task oriented. Vedic astrology, and I don't know if this is true of the traditional practice, but certainly the modern practice of it is that they tend to look at your chart and prescribe things for you, and that makes a lot of sense to people that are doing modern astrology because they're used to their natal chart as sort of the be all and the end all. And they'll look at their chart and want to say, well, what should I, he'll say, here's my chart, what should I get? And I'll be like, well, it sort of depends on what you want to accomplish. So I started looking at people's charts, and I think it makes, obviously it would make sense that, depending on your chart, you might have different interactions with the planets. What I do is just look at the essential dignity, that is the pluses and minuses in terms of the sign and the rulership and then detriment and fall, and then also retrograde and combustion, which are major accidental dignities. And then if the planet is really well dignified in your chart, it seems to me that you have a really good pre-existing relationship with that planet. For example, I have Jupiter Pisces. Jupiter rules Pisces, so I have a lot of success with Jupiter, talismans and Jupiter magic. If the planet is, 0, then it's fine. It's kind of weak, but you don't have any problem with it. If the planet's afflicted, though, like if it's in detriment, fall, retrograde, or combust, then you kind of have a little bit of a bad relationship with them. It's not deadly, but then you want to think about, well, is a talisman the best way to deal with them? And what I'll often suggest in those circumstances is that people do what's called planetary charity, which is from Vedic astrology. And so, for example, if you had an afflicted Saturn, you do an invocation of Saturn, make a vow, and say, I'll tell you what, I'll give you, make a donation to a Saturn-ruled person or Saturn-ruled thing a certain number of times, and you don't break that vow. And then you do, say, Saturn day, Saturn hour. So, for example, a homeless person is ruled by Saturn. You go make a donation to a homeless person like 3 Saturdays at Saturn hour. And it's kind of like helping you get a better relationship. They kind of get them to, to think well of you without bringing that kind of energy into your situation. Now, I have had students of mine that had afflicted planets that said, no, I'm going to go ahead and do the talisman anyway. Sometimes they get good results, sometimes they don't. It's a little more unpredictable. And a reasonable amount of time, those people have kind of had difficult times, but said to me, it was worthwhile from a spiritual standpoint. So, but mostly, again, when people are coming to me, they're not looking for bad times for spiritual growth. They're looking to, to have positive stuff happen. So that's why I tend to focus on the well-dignified planets in your chart for talismans. Now, Vedic, it's sort of, I've seen different things. I've seen sometimes they'll say avoid afflicted planets for talismans. Other times they'll say, oh no, you should have a talisman of an afflicted planet or whatever. So I don't exactly know how they do it, but they don't necessarily follow my practice. And my practice is a little bit, it's sort of, I had to kind of come up with it on my own. And like I said, our traditional sources didn't tell us like how do you prescribe based on their chart exactly. So that's sort of a common sense thing from my standpoint, and also just my experience over 20 years of working. So I definitely wouldn't say that's the only way to fly, but it does seem to work with my clients that if you get a planet that's well, dignified in your chart, that you can work with the talismans of it. And we don't look at aspects, we don't look at house placement, things like that. But basically just the essential dignity of the planets. It says, okay, can you talk a little bit more? Let me see here about assigning points for the various conditions of the planets. The basic ones are for essential dignities and debilities are sign is +5, exultation is +4, triplicity rulership is air, earth, fire, and water, and that's split up among the planets while they rule that, and often by day or by night is +3. Term rulership, each of the signs is split up into subsections called terms or bounds, which are +2, and then face, which is 36 decans, 36 faces, each is 10 degrees of the sign, it's +1. And then the debilities are detriment, which is the sign opposite to your sign, your planet you rule. Like, for example, the sun rules Leo, so he's in detriment in Aquarius. And then fall, which is a sign opposite to the exaltation of the planet. So, for example, Venus is exalted in Pisces, so she's in fall in Virgo. And so that's -4. And so those are the main plus minus essential dignity points. And each of them has, and this is what Susan was alluding to, is that you don't want to just look at the points, you want to look at the underlying, each of them has a sort of nuanced meaning that kind of gives you a better sense of it than just the plus or minus. So in a new message, okay. The mother form. It says, Austin mentioned to me that in Vedic astrology, if you got an afflicted planet in your chart, you might work with the more gentle mother form of whatever god you're dealing with, since most from gods come with a variety of avatars in Hinduism. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me, but I don't know how you do that in Western astrology because we don't really have mother forms in the Western astrology. So, it's, the reality of it is that if you look at your natal chart, you got some good stuff, you got some weak stuff, you got some stuff that's afflicted, and that just is the way it is. It's a bit like me, and like my left arm is weaker than my right arm, and I could work it out, but It's just always the reality of us. So that's what makes us who we are, is the pluses and minuses. And so we can't really do chart surgery. I mean, you can ameliorate stuff to a certain extent, but you're always going to be like, for example, I have a tendency to maybe get angry. I can be less angry, but I'll never be a wallflower. So it's just one of those things of like, I do get people that are sort of thinking, well, can I just change my chart? And I'm like, not exactly. I mean, it's a complicated question, but you can work on stuff, but the only way to really escape your chart is to, basically become enlightened. And that's a whole different process that we're getting into. Okay, so planetary day begins at sunset. Let's look at this. It says several magical systems are closely tied to Kabbalah, also Wicca. The day cycle of 24 hours begins at sunset, evening and night following the sunrise and day. Seems backwards from others in which the planetary day begins at sunset. Basically 12 hours before this. I mean, I don't think is this wrong? I don't know. I mean, that's a system I don't know how they do the assignment of the hours or whatever. I mean, if it starts at night and it's ruled by it is going to be a different hour assignment. I don't know about it being wrong. It's certainly different. It's not one I've ever worked with, but it doesn't seem irrational either. So I really don't believe in right and wrong exactly. I think there's no right answer. I guess I'll put it this way: there's no right answer, but there's lots of wrong ones. So there's a lot of possible ways to go. And I certainly wouldn't want to say that the method I use or even traditional astrology is the only way to fly. It's kind of useful to study it. It has a lot of history behind it. And, it's fascinating. But, it really depends on what you're pulled to. Same thing with my style of practice, the devotional practice. I mean, that's not everybody's cup of tea. And if you're into goetic stuff or whatever, that's great. That's your destiny. If that's what you're called to do, then that's what you got to do. I mean, everybody has a destiny. Everyone has a dharma. And that's the most important thing, is to find what you're really called to do. But some people find this stuff fascinating. I'll get, students and everything, and they just, this is it. And that's certainly how I felt when I came across astrological magic. I just got so excited, and I've continued to have that excitement and enthusiasm for doing it. That's why I continue to do it after 20 years. And I think that's the greatest thing of all, is to find out what really kind of engages your enthusiasm and excitement. And so, hopefully with this is kind of giving a little bit of a taste of the incredible depth and complexity that's possible with this. We're only sort of scratching the surface on what you can do with planetary hours and astrological magic and things like that. I have a couple different courses. I have the Planetary Magic mini course, which is basically talks about planetary hours, provides you with images both in color and black and white of all the planets, so you can make paper talismans. And then, tells you how to do the planetary hour and also how to do consecrations and stuff. And then I have a full astrological magic course that goes in detail about all this stuff. Planets, fixed stars, mansions of the moon, decans, house-based talismans, things like that. And that's a much more involved process, but I have those courses for people that are interested. One thing that's useful to do if you're a magician is to start timing your ritual this way. I mean, it really punches up the power if you pick at an appropriate time. It's sort of like, you start driving at green lights all the way through. It's kind of cool to be able to time things that way. And that's a useful thing to do too if you're into ceremonial magic, is to time the ritual that way. When I started off, we didn't have the pick-a-trick stuff, so I was doing hoodoo and root work stuff, and I would time that astrologically, and that got some really cool effects too. They in fact used a certain amount of particularly planetary hour stuff, or the zodiacal man, where they assign the signs. This is traditional. The sign, like the Aries is the head, Taurus is the neck. They did that a lot in root work too. So there's a lot of really cool crossover between astrology. Just like Eric was saying before, the timing method is really great, and you can just use that in all sorts of different areas. So that's an hour, and I just want to see if people have questions, and to throw it open in terms of if we can go, what do people want to find out about or talk more about?
Well, I have a sort of a quick question about strength in general. I mean, because we talk a lot about, how strong a planet is and how you want to work with it when it's strong. But why that doesn't necessarily imply, that that's going to be a subjectively good experience, right? I mean, it's like I'm not really sure how to phrase this question, but I'm trying to draw a distinction between the strength of a planet and its constructiveness, I guess. Because like if Mars is really strong, wouldn't you expect that it would be strong for evil as well as strong for good?
It gets complicated because what you're talking about too is the difference between planets being benefic and planets being malefic.
Right.
And so all these things come into play. What Guido Bonatti, who's a 13th century Italian astrologer, says about the malefics, which are traditionally Saturn and Mars, is this: when they become highly dignified, then they put away a lot of that malefic quality. So for example, I have Saturn and Aquarius rising in my chart, so that's a very strong placement for him, very well located in the chart. But it still brings a certain amount of the Saturnine qualities of melancholy and loneliness and hard work and that sort of stuff. So, but nevertheless, that's about as positive as you can get for Saturn, which is pretty positive. And then it depends on whether house they're ruling. For example, if you have Saturn, I have Saturn ruling the 12th house. So if I'm talking about a 12th house sort of, that's like secret enemies. So yeah, I have super powerful secret enemies. But because he's a dignified malefic ruling the 12th house, the evil that the 12th house people do to me tends to turn to good. So it gets really quite complicated in terms of putting that stuff together. Now, if a planet's afflicted, that's what I would say is interesting about affliction is, does that mean it's just super weak, or does that mean it's really strong for evil, as you're saying? But if you have Jupiter afflicted, right, he could be unable to accomplish what you want to accomplish, or he could actually be going out and doing bad stuff. I mean, the real malefics in a lot of ways are Venus and Jupiter, because Venus is they're against you overindulgence, and too much sex and drugs and all that sort of stuff. And whereas the Saturn and Mars are the great teachers, nobody becomes wise except for suffering. And so
I guess, part of what my question involves, I guess, is, if you're working, suppose you have a very well, a planet with decent dignity in your chart and you're working with it in a strong condition. Does that mean that you have more agency over how you look for it to manifest?
it very much depends, because you're getting back to fate and free will again.
I know, it always comes down to that.
So it's sort of like, in the sense of like, like I said, it very much depends on what perspective you're coming from, because there is a perspective from which there is no self, and therefore there is no free will, but there's really not fate either. So I tend to see a more fated quality to things. Just as an astrologer, people ask me, like, I've done 5,000 horary questions for clients, and most of those come up correctly. So if everyone can just do whatever they want and there's no fate, then that would be kind of hard to see how you could minutely predict all this specific stuff. But nevertheless, it does appear from perspective that you get choices. So
don't you feel that like fate has an archetypal shape to it, but within that, there's a lot of ways that an archetype can manifest.
You would feel like if you're a person in 2018, right, in American culture, right, you're definitely going to feel you have free will, because that's what the culture tells you have. If you go to a movie, it's always about you can change your fate. Oh, you can change your future. Every time the time travel movies, they always end up getting what they want in the end. And you as the separate ego self can get what you want, and don't feel like you can't have everything you want to do. Which is interesting, because I remember talking to my mother. I think she's like 75 at the time, and I was saying, you can't get what you want. She's like, oh yeah, because a 75-year-old understands that you can't always get what you want. A 25-year-old, though, is going to assume that you can, because that's, again, part of that age. So it's a perspective. And so if you're having that perspective, then it's like when I was young, my parents would tell me, when you get older, you understand. And I'm like, I used to make me so mad. But now that I am older, I understand. So what I would say about free will is that it is true from a particular perspective. And so always it's not true.
And it always depends on your circumstances. I think you gave, or somebody gave, a great example of, like, you're born, you're a young person in 1939, you're Jewish, you're living in Eastern Europe, and you have a fantastic chart. Might mean you get to survive. Yeah,
right, exactly. That's the thing. Because that's the other thing too, is that if you look at Bill Gates's chart, richest man in the world for a long time, it's fine, but it's not like insane for wealth. The wealth indicators there are good. He was the right guy at the right time.
Mm.
you know. And so there's other factors, you know, that go into the thing. So the ego self really wants to believe in free will. That's really important. And it's just, you know, it seems very unfair that you don't get whatever you want, you know. And that's a particular level of understanding. There's another level of like, and you know, Eastern, they'll be like, say, oh, they're fatalistic, but it's like, yeah, it's a little easier to live when you accept things that come up. But you can't be a magician if you don't have will. You know, if you're not going to go out and want to do the change, then you're not going to be able to do magic. So there's not, it's very complex. And one of the beautiful things about astrology is that you get to see this interplay between fate and free will. And so, but I don't know when I do magic. I remember my very first talisman was this pest control magic. And to tell you the truth, after I did it, I was confused as to whether I had caused the change or announced the change. You know, is it really it really got, and I still to this day have not resolved that. Nevertheless, I still do magic, but I don't really, I can't say that I had this idea and I caused it or whatever necessarily as an ultimate view of reality. But that's what I needed to get through I mean, I had a lot of work to do today. I was briefing stuff and doing all the stuff, so I feel like I got to do it. You know, I have to act. If I don't act, it's not going to get done. But I don't have a strong view of what, because you can't, I said the recognition is that it's both fate and free will simultaneously, that the ultimate reality has the quality of both fate and free will, which is really weird. You start thinking about that, it gets really very confusing. So great question, you know, and we do seem to get back to that when we talk, but it's like we'll probably never resolve that. It'll be something we can talk about forever about it. Let's see here, geomantic figures, geometric characters of the planets, ominous names. Okay, it says, I love using the geometric characters of the planets for talismans. Some of the names are rather ominous. Does my knowledge and will in using these characters, which I derive from the original dot matrices, does my positive application of these planetary characters balance out the negative connotations of the source? I don't know anything about geomantic characters of the planets for talismans. I've seen them in Agrippa, but I haven't ever used them. So I don't know what the influence of them is in terms of using them talismanically. I think if a missio like is loss, it seems to me that's going to cause loss. I mean, one of the things about traditional astrology is that it's very predictive. And so if you're going to predict things, you need to be able to cover everything from the really positive to neutral to really negative. So that's why there's these pluses and minuses. And so you have to acknowledge the existence of what appears to be, at least from our normal perspective, to be negative stuff. And everything isn't positive. Whereas modern astrology comes from a more psychological perspective, and they want to have people benefit from it. You don't come into the psychologist and say, well, a third of people don't benefit from this. You want to be upbeat, enthused, and give everyone a chance to kind of, you know, get the therapeutic use of it. So that's great for that. But for predictive, it's not, you don't want to have a system that has only positives, you know? And so that's just sort of the difference is that, you know, and we're also, it's interesting, there's 360 degrees of the zodiac. So each of the 360 degrees has an image traditionally. And some of them are kind of negative. And that really flips modern people out. I guess it didn't bother traditional people. I mean, like, I don't know, mine's sort of like, you know, man with his head cut off or something, which I'm like, okay. But I'm almost reluctant to give them to people because they get so freaked out if they have one that doesn't seem totally positive. Now, the Sabian symbols, which were in 1935, 360 degrees, every single one of those was positive. So you never have to worry about getting flipped out by that stuff. But I think that as we deal with the reality, we have to recognize that there's some stuff that's going to appear to us to be positive and some that's going to appear to be negative. And you know, how much you can change that, I'm not. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can. But the basic question for the geomantic stuff is I haven't done those enough to know how they work. So I don't know if you use a missio or the negative ones, whether it's going to have a positive or negative effect. I don't know if your intention overcomes the basic nature of the thing. I would tend to think that it only does to a certain extent. It wouldn't entirely, you know, if I was going to have a positive, I wouldn't use a positive, you know, greater fortune. I would use greater fortune if I wanted to have a really positive outcome. I guess that would be my feeling about it, but I don't know. Ask Al Cummings. Yeah, definitely. That was the message. That's always good. Take advantage of all this great expertise or Austin, you know, that's again, the comment from him about the Vedic was very interesting too. And that's potentially possible. I mean, everything has like a positive and negative side to it. I just don't know how much of the malefic generally the positive side of the malefics comes when they're dignified, as we were talking about that. So that's an interesting question. Or planetary charity. You can always do planetary charity. You never have to worry about the planet's state in your chart or even the state in the heavens. If you're doing planetary charity, it's a real positive, it's a very positive practice. So let's see where we are, 210. Okay, so again, let's see. I've been talking a lot. So if there's other people who have questions, I'm excited to deal with any questions anyone has, or anywhere we could go with this. So I was talking to Darren beforehand, and people were talking. He was saying that you guys, do a lot of tarot stuff, and so I'm just curious as what kind of other astrological stuff you guys have been delving into too. That could be something someone could enlighten me about. If anyone wants to jump in.
Well, one thing that we do a lot of on the group is we do spells with our cards. So
cool.
So in the morning we'll draw, most of us draw 2 cards, and we'll do a little spell based on that. I've been trying to hit the first hour of the day most of the time. And what we'll do is we'll use the correspondences in the spells to craft the spells. So, if you draw a card that has a relationship to Capricorn or Mercury or whatever, you'll build that some of the correspondences of those gods and signs into the spell in the attempt to sort of affect the manifestation of it through the day. And I don't probably take as much, I don't have as much as awareness of the condition of the planets as someone like you might at the time that I'm doing the spell. But at the same time, I'll be very aware of, if there's some kind of alignment with the day or the hour, something like that. And I don't know, I think it's a really interesting mix, I think, to pull in tarot, because we have, in addition to whatever astrological, Kabbalistic, elemental correspondences we're dealing with, we also have like a vocabulary of iconography that we're dealing with in every card, and the way the artist has chosen to portray it. So like yesterday, I drew the 2 of Pentacles with discs, and it was which happens to be associated with Jupiter in Capricorn, and Jupiter's rulership of Capricorn 1. And and it was pretty interesting for me. But one of the really funny things that eventuated from it was that I happened to fall and twist my ankle yesterday, and and it just kind of made me laugh because Jupiter's in fall.
Yeah, and Capricorn is the legs.
Yeah.
That's funny. So do you so Jupiter and Capricorn? Do you do Saturn or do you do Capricorn?
So I will blend them both. So if the way that Austin once put it to me was that you get both the rulership, you get both Saturn, and you get both. You get both the sign rulership and the face rulership at the same time. So you get Jupiter effects, but you also get Saturn effects.
Well, I was even asking if you get Capricorn effects.
Oh, Capricorn effects. Well, I certainly felt like I did, but I don't know. I definitely have. For example, like I'll very often draw one of the Pisces cards on a day that I'm going swimming, right? So it's pretty typical for something like that to happen, and I think everybody else has had effects like that as well. I don't know. Anybody else want to jump in? And
so one of the things I've been doing is my new book it's called Fixed Sign, Star, and Constellation Talismans. So fixed star is kind of, fixed stars are a little weird, but you can think, okay, here's the fixed star, you have it rising. Constellation is made up of fixed stars, so it's kind of like, again, like a fixed star talisman, but it's sign talismans, because those are the zodiacal signs, they have such a more of a use. And it's funny because there are sign talismans. Normally the planets are seen as the active, and the you can almost think of them as like lights, whereas the signs are like stained glass. So their light is reflected to these different kinds of stained glass. But the signs have a spirit too. They just, people don't deal with them as much. More typically, sign talismans are like health talismans. Like if you had a headache, you do Aries, because it's the head. But I realized that you could do like sign talismans, like with either with the moon or the sun in those signs. And so I did that in the book. It's a little bit kind of avant-garde, but I thought, that's kind of interesting because, everyone is into their signs because of sun signs, but they're not so much used in traditional astrology on their own, but they, it's just one of those things. So I was kind of excited about putting that in there and wanting to do a little more work with that myself.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. I mean, like, I'll do a little bit of that in the sense that, I have this line of zodiacal perfumes that I made, and like, so right now, whenever it's Saturday, I always use a little bit in the rites in the morning, but right now, because Saturn's in Capricorn, I use the Capricorn one, not the Aquarius one, kind of a thing, which just seems to make sense.
That's so cool.
It is cool. Can you say more about the fixed star talismans?
Yeah. So fixed stars, we were talking about planetary magic, but we'll just range out whatever we want. We're not going to be stopped by these artificial boundaries. So, there's about 1,000 visible fixed stars, and they're grouped into 48 constellations. And so there's 12 zodiacal constellations and 36 extra zodiacal constellations. And the signs are the constellations that the apparent path of the sun, the ecliptic, passes through originally. Now, they're always irregular. They never were, because the sign is exactly 30 degrees. It's a way of dividing up 360 degrees of the circle. And you can precisely place anything based on its, zodiacal longitude. So if you say 3 Aries, you know exactly where it is. You can do talismans for I'm sure any of the 1,000, but we don't have descriptions of what to use them for, or anything, how to make their talismans for more than about 15. So there's a manuscript called Hermes on the 15 Fixed Stars that was circulating in the Middle Ages, and it tells us the image, the sigil, the stones and plants ruled by the fixed star, and then also what it does, what its function is. And so that's really useful. We got a ton of information that we can make their talisman. And recently this is what I'm willing to do as far as additions. After 20 years of practice, I added one fixed star in, which is Fomalhaut, because Fomalhaut is conjunct a really.
I was just about to ask you about Fomalhaut.
Yeah, is conjunct a significant part of my chart, so I feel like I have some insight into it. Plus, Fomalhaut is one of the, I think it's minor, but I still like it, one of the 4 Watcher stars that's associated with one of the archangels, Archangel Gabriel. So for that we have, and plus it's a fish. So we got an image of a fish. We know that Gabriel is a spirit that's associated with it, an angel. And we also have a little bit idea what kind of effects. So I think it's been helpful for me in terms of like fame and things like that for spiritual growth in my life. So that was the one, after 20 years, I added that into my practice. And so.
Is that available, by the way?
Yeah, well, I have it.
It's on my Ascendant.
they're on my website. And so I was going to probably do a promotion stuff next week and just like put on my Facebook page. But there are, I have an Arabic version and an English version. I started to do that stuff now. So yeah, they're on the website right now.
Cool.
But yeah, I was kind of drawn to that. And that's what I felt like, this is a particular, because sometimes people say, oh, I'll just do Rigel or whatever. And I'm like, well, how do we know how to invoke that spirit? And if you had a dream or a vision or something like that, or some kind of source, then I feel more comfortable with it. With this one, I felt enough of a connection that I felt like, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and add a little bit. That's my one addition so far to the canon, so to speak. But so it's kind of exciting, and what's happening is, like I said, is the more people do this, we get all these different little areas kind of developed, and people doing various different things. Like I said, Austin Coppock or Alec Cummings or whatever are doing all this cool stuff, and all sorts of people out there that are less well known that are doing all sorts of interesting stuff. So it's a really great time to be doing any of these subjects. And you can see by the number of people that showed up today that, so let's see what we got here. Mundane astrological magic. It kind of reminds me, that's an interesting question. That kind of reminds me of people that claim to be able to stop hurricanes. And I'm like, I don't know about that. I mean, maybe, but it's like, if you could do that, I suppose you've got to be able to make yourself a billionaire. I mean, that's a tremendous amount. Or like to change the election. I mean, it just seems like there's only so much we can do with that individually. I mean, I suppose if you get aligned with a greater current, you can do stuff. But I'm just a little. I mean, it seems like it's possible, but if you're doing it, then probably people doing it. That's what someone told me. They said this guy was a little more visionary, and he had he had a spirit. He asked about the lottery, and the spirit started laughing and said, "Come along with me." So they kind of astrally traveled to the lottery office. It was covered with all this kind of gunk and stuff from other people, all these people doing magic. You can imagine how much magic is being done on the lottery. So I had a student of mine in Puerto Rico, and he kept getting hired by all the different politicians and the governor and everything to do magic on each other. So those guys apparently are doing tons of Santeria and stuff like that already. So that's an interesting question as to how much magic is being done to affect elections in different ways. So, and then how much we individually have an effect on it. So I think it's worthwhile. I mean, if you can give it a shot, but I don't have any specific recipes in terms of doing, any kind of political magic. I don't know how that would be. I think you could do their picture, their something like that to connect it to them, but I don't know how effective. I haven't ever done any of that. So interesting question, but not anything I have any direct experience with myself. So let's see, where are we in terms of time? 2:20. Okay. Darren, how long are we going to go? I'm happy to keep going as long as people ask questions.
Well, we had blocked out from 2 to 4, so you can go on long or as little as more.
Yeah, well, it's funny because it's always nice to, like I said, questions are useful. And I can obviously to keep talking about various things. And Susan's been doing a great job of like giving me great questions to work with as well. Do you want to give us another one, Susie?
Yeah, I just did actually in the chat.
Okay, here we go.
So yeah, no, that's all right. So I was just going to ask you about substitutions. So you're dealing with some grimoires that are very much of their time, right? And and there's a lot of things that as modern people we're not going to want to do, right? So what do you do about things like animal sacrifice?
Oh, I don't. I'm a Buddhist, so I don't do animal sacrifice.
Well, right, but is there something? I mean, would you offer up a depiction of the animal, for example, or would you, how would you address that?
It's funny because this is a different question from people saying, oh, it's all coded, and when they said what goat, they really just meant Artemisia, or something like that. I've seen that before, which I don't think is true. I think they meant a white goat. So. The thing is that the death or life of anything has a tremendous amount of energy. And so animal sacrifice is obviously very powerful. Personally, I don't like the negative karma and the negative energy. And, the spirits apparently that like blood is not particularly a spirit that I want to be associating with, particularly. Not to say that they're not powerful and that there's not traditions that do animal sacrifice. I'm not going to condemn those traditions either. But for myself, I look at Picatrix and they say, if you want to invoke Picatrix, as Saturn, then what you do is you dress in black clothing and black shoes, and you make an incense burner out of, black metal, and you use the Saturn incense, and then you get Saturn in a good position, and, he's dignified by sign and rising, and then you prostrate yourself, and then you kill a black goat, and then you do this invocation. I just don't do the black goat.
Right. Yeah.
You just add all the other stuff in and just throw that out because that's not something that I want to be doing. And I think that it's just not necessary to do that stuff. And I always went through that thing with Picatrix when we translated it. Was like, should we even translate this stuff? And it's like, undoubtedly, there's going to be people that go out and do it. And so that's kind of the downside of it. On the other hand, I hate to be censoring stuff, but that's partly like why I wasn't ever too obsessed about whether I got whether it's the correct black goat or black sheep or whatever. Maybe it's not so important. I mean, I suppose from an academic, you obviously want to get it perfect. But
well, there are people who are really, really, anal about that stuff. Like, Stephen Skinner, like if you don't have exactly the right parchment made from exactly the right skin of the exactly right animal, it's not going to work, kind of a thing. And and you were saying that yes, there's a lot of energy tied up in the sacrifice of a life, right? So so it's sort of like it always kind of comes down to these questions of what can you do and what should you do, right? The question of whether something has an effect, and then the question of if it does, do you want to take advantage of that or not? And I think that's really a personal decision.
Yeah, I would say, I've certainly over 20 years, and a lot of talismans. We've never done any animal sacrifice, so we certainly had a lot of people give us good feedback, and I've noticed really positive effects myself. So it doesn't seem to be necessary. If it was necessary, then I guess I'd have to find something else to do with myself. I don't want to do
Well,
it.
this also raises sort of a larger question that I think about a lot of the time as far as magic goes. I mean, where do you fall in terms of like, um, there's some people who believe that you have to what extent can you follow a recipe and have it work? To what extent do you need to be personally involved? To what extent does your magic have to be personal, I guess?
It's funny because my wife is this amazing cook, right? She never follows a recipe. I mean, she knows all the cooking techniques that she uses, the herbs and the spices and the things that she deals with. She knows how the stuff interacts. So she can say, okay, what have I got in the cupboard? And I can just make stuff because she's got such a root understanding of it, right? And nothing's the same. She never makes anything the same way the second time. So I could never cook like that. I always had to use a recipe or I couldn't get the proportions right. And so I think that shows a high level of mastery. What you find though, it's kind of funny. I'll have people that my students will like, look at this election. I'm like, oh yeah, I found that one too. Once you're trained in the same discipline, with the same teacher or the same, like for example, everyone who does horror, who's been with a QHP, like someone like John Frawley or Lee Lehman or Deb Holding or Sue Ward, there's a lot of similarities in their analysis because they're all in the same school and they've all been trained similarly. So that's what I would say about that is that what I would talk about is ritual, because I think with the talismanic choice of the election, I'm very precise and persnickety about that. But what ritual you do, that I think it really does need to be personal. And I mean, you can read. I mean, people email me and say, "Oh, I rewrote this Picatrix thing." I'm like, "Well, that's what I did." I mean, I have these daily invocations that are sort of edited and chopped down. And that's what I would say is that I prefer a short, heartfelt, intense, inspiring ritual to spending 3 hours reading off the exact thing out of the book.
Yeah, I mean,
It's my
I think
preference.
that there's definitely something to be said for that because, I think about this a lot because I have a lot of friends who are, psychic to some degree or Claire something. And I think a lot about what I call magic for those of us not named Claire. And, and the idea that, how do you know if what you're doing has meaning, or has traction? And I think the personal element is really important in that at some level because it has to be your own lexicon, your own language, your own intention. And that's one reason why I went on this huge project this last year of memorizing the Orphic hymns in Greek, because I sort of felt like if I say it, I'm paying attention to what I mean. And I'm, if I'm reading it, it's so hard, right? Because I barely understand the Greek as it is. But if it's loaded up there, then I have my eyeballs free anyway, and my brain can engage a little bit more with the words and, and try to think about it a little bit more. So, I mean, I guess that my theory, on the other hand, you have people who say like, you do Enochian magic, you do angelic magic, and if you just follow the steps, you're going to be like plugging your finger in a light socket. It doesn't matter what you think, or what your intention is. So I don't know.
I mean, I think there's also, Iamblichus talks about, you don't change the original, the barbarous names, you do it because those resonate. I mean, it's not having understanding it or your personal stuff with it so much as it's just you resonate with the gods. And so it just goes back and forth. I said, once we start saying, like I said, once we start saying it has to be this way, then we're probably wrong. But at the same time, there's lots of wrong answers too. I mean, there's people they're fooling themselves and not getting any real results out of it either. So it's not like, oh, it's all relative and everything works. So it's very complicated to figure out. But again, I was thinking about that as you're saying that, when you do those Orphic hymns, you're clicking into this incredible stream of tradition of people that have done this before, and it's been done in temples, and there's so you get to click into that, and so many other people, and spirits that are tuned into that you would miss if you made it up yourself. If you just wrote it from scratch, you wouldn't have. On the other hand, if you do it from scratch, then it's really heartfelt and inspiring for you. So there's different sources of energy and different sources of power from those.
Right, and that's the whole argument in chaos magic, right? That you're trying to pick up on streams of, that are meaningful to you. and it doesn't really matter whether that path has been hacked before or not. But I tend to agree that, it helps if somebody else has kind of paved the way. There's a road.
There was in the Waking Life, in the movie, there's a discussion between these two characters, and they're talking about the New York Times.
Yeah.
When the New York Times, they said, they took these people and they isolated them, and they had them do day-old New York Times crossword puzzles, and they were able to do it much easier because the collective mind had already done them before. So,
that explains a lot.
so that's the thing, is that we don't really exist as individuals. That's a perspective, that I'm a separate self, and our minds are all connected, and there is only mind. So that there's a lot of different levels of that, and I think that that's what's amazing about doing this stuff now, is that we're in touch with all this incredible. I mean, the translations, like there's going to be new translations of Picatrix coming out, which I'm like, yay, that's great. And I think an Arabic one, there's an academic one that's already, I think, on Amazon. I'm like, oh, this is fabulous. But the amount of information that's available to us, and the amount of people that are seriously, doing this work that we can contact or read about, or, do these video conferences, it's just insane. I think. Yeah.
Hey, aren't you doing an Agrippa? I thought you were working on.
No, Eric Perdue, he had been doing. I did the first book. There's 3 books of occult philosophy, and I think Austin was going to do it, or he was tied in with it somehow. And then the thing about Eric is that he really wants to get it right, and so that's one thing, that he's really been meticulous about his work. So that slows things down, and I don't know what else is going on with that. So that'll be cool to have that. He comes out with that. Of course, what's funny about it is that the JF, the 17th century translation, is not bad. I mean, if you run into problems, I tend to look at the Latin, which not necessarily everyone can do, but it gets you 90% of the way there. And I think that's it's awesome to have that stuff out there. And it'd be good to have a new translation, but we won't have to, it's not like we can't have access to it at all if we don't have that translation. It certainly would be better than the JF, but
you've got a question from Mel here.
Okay. So speaking about black and Saturn, I read that the Saphira color for the planet black is the queen scale color for Venus. Saturn is used for spiritual concerns, while the planetary color is used for mundane matters. Indigo is a planetary color as opposed to color of Venus. Wow, this is getting into all this Kabbalistic, correspondence stuff that I don't know anything about. I mean, this isn't the astrological magic style of it traditionally, so I don't know. It's just a different system that I'm used to. So it certainly could work. I just don't know anything about. I'd have to say I don't know anything about it in terms of.
Okay. That actually reminds me of another question I wanted to ask you, which is about systems, different systems, because you're an initiate of a number of different traditions, and so that leads to the question of like, how do you're not just throwing them all together into like a personal, individualized mishmash of stuff. I mean, do you keep separate altars? Do you do, how do you deal with that?
Well, if you look behind me on my picture here, you can see above my head here, right there, that's a Kamidana. And so that's a Japanese Shinto altar, and it's facing the right direction. It's up high, and enshrined in that are ofuda, or sort of like talismans for 3 different kami or spirits. One in the middle is Inari, who's sort of, that's the fox spirits, like rice harvest. And then there's Abinoseme, who's like the Merlin of Japan. And then there's some spirits from the Kamo shrine. And I have an offering thing in front of it. I do salt and water and sake and rice. And I have a Japanese invocation I do when I do that. I do the normal approach to that every day. But then right next to it is a Buddhist altar. And then next to that is a 7th mansion altar. And then behind here is that's my fixed star altar. And then I've got a planetary altar. So I do have separate altars. Every day when I do the planetary invocation, I also do sort of a greeting or whatever, veneration of the Shinto altar. I light about 10 candles for all the different planets and stuff. And I do 3 Hail Marys, and I do the Fatiha, which is the Muslim opening prayer, and then I do the planetary invocation.
Wow.
So at the same time, I'm baptized as a Christian, and I started going to church again. I'm initiated Sufi, and I'm doing the heavy Sufi stuff. And then I'm also initiated as a Buddhist in the Soto Zen and then Shingon. So, but there's also a certain amount of crossover with that. Like I said, the Sufi stuff it's very traditional to use astrological timing. So that's not anything new. And we're doing this book from the Shams el-Arif, which is sort of an esoteric Muslim source. Certainly like Ficino was a Christian, all the, Lilly, all those Christian astrology. I mean, so I'm kind of trotting a path that's already been done. I mean, the esoteric Buddhism, they have a lot of not a lot, but they have a significant amount of astrological magic built into it from the Taoist Myodo. So the synthesis is very careful, I don't just as you said, mishmash it all together, but I'm starting to synthesize a little bit. For example, the seventh mansion talisman, the image from Picatrix is a man with his hands together praying as to heaven. And the image here is of a Buddhist monk in Gasho. So the image fits, but it's a Buddhist image. So I like that. But, it's not like I just threw it together. It's actually kind of fits the image. So
yeah, could you say a little bit more about the seventh mansion? I think I remember you work with the third and the seventh.
Yeah, what I do is I have talismans, and then I also have I have some mirrors that I made for myself, etched mirrors that I don't do anymore because the chemicals are so intense. So every month when the moon comes to the third mansion, the moon comes to the seventh mansion, I do an invocation of those mansion. I think my sense of the third mansion is it's a woman in the image, so I have more of a feminine feel for her name is a Mixiel, according to Agrippa, so that's more female. The seventh mansion, because it's got a monk on it, I feel a little more masculine. Like Algo, I don't know. Algo could be male or female. I don't know whether Algo's are male or female. That's when I don't have whereas Spica seems to be female because it's, it's in Virgo and things like that. So that's an interesting question. I don't know if the angels really have gender, but that's.
Well, I kind of would be interested if you feel comfortable sharing in what sort of your subjective experience of magic is in a way. I mean, because it's so personal, and we've kind of talked in the past about the kind of ridiculous fixation on evocation to visual manifestation, and that, so on the other hand, for those of us who grew up as essentially, being in a materialist culture, it's pretty hard to get over your issues of doubt and skepticism, right? So, how did you deal with that?
I'll give an example of that. When I started doing mirrors, I got really taken with mirrors. Oh, that's really great because I could make them. I can't do cast metal talismans because you need to have a furnace and it's 2,000 degree molten metal and all this. It's very complex to do it. So I was so excited to have a technique I could use myself. So I started looking for mirrors. So I did Picatrix mirrors, and then I got this book called I think it's the Munich Necromantic Handbook, and they had this black mirror of Lilith, and I thought, oh, that's cool. So I got this beautiful black glass, and I thought, well, I'll just etch the mirror, and I won't invoke Lilith, but it's just so cool. I just got to make these. So I made one, no problem. Two, no problem. The third one, as soon as I did the etching, I immediately was sicker than I think I've been in my life. I had this terrible vertigo attacks, and I just felt like I was going to puke. And so I had to lay down. I was on the floor for about 3 or 4 hours. I couldn't even get up. And what I ended up doing is I had a friend of mine who had some experience with Lilith. He said, okay, bury the mirror at a crossroads. So I did that, and then I buried it for 24 hours, came back, dug it up, broke it, and buried it again, and that broke the connection. But it was this awful experience. And but what happened is people loved it because they're like, it's real. Like, oh, it really worked. And people kept emailing me asking where they could buy the mirrors. And I'll just say, I just thought that was really funny. Now, another guy told me, this is a guy who's into this sort of really I hesitate to call it black magic because it's kind of like they get into the whole Kabbalistic thing with it's hard to describe what it is. It's they take it's definitely a left-hand path approach, and I forget what the name of it is, the type of it, but this is super, I wouldn't even call it evil because it's almost beyond evil. But he was like, oh yeah, that's the way Lilith is. If you're gonna, you just have to go, you just have to move through that stuff. That's the way that spirit, you just have to put up with it. So that was his reaction to it. So just as you say though, people are willing, they're just desperate to find anything that goes against atheistic materialistic nihilism, which is the modern worldview. Nothing exists except matter and energy, and there's no spiritual realm, no spiritual beings, and life is, meaningless and pointless, ultimately.
And I have a lot of sympathy for that, I mean, even as a person who, I consider myself a practitioner, I still have, real moments of doubt and uncertainty. And I don't blame anyone for experiencing that. And I know that Gordon White always says, on RuneSoup, that if you really want to have your doubts blown away, then go take a Ouija board into an abandoned insane asylum. I don't recommend it, but that will take care of it. But do you remember what your sort of, wow, this is real moment was? Your first, I mean?
It's hard to say because I didn't have I mean, I'd have to say that when I first dropped acid, and that was when I first recognized that there was other than the consensus reality could exist. And so that's one of the things that's really useful about hallucinogenic, psychedelic drugs, is that you can't really deny the existence of different realities. So, but it's more that, like, for example, having done 4,000 horrors and it's right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, that the time of the question, and then all of a sudden, so I didn't really have a same way with my in Kensho experiences. I didn't really have a spectacular, my head blowing off, kind of lights, fireworks sort of thing. It's probably better in a lot of ways not to have that experience that way. What instead was more then there was the experience of no self. With the magical stuff is like, after a long period, it's like my worldview now is a traditional worldview, is that everything is full of spirit, and everything is alive. And that's what reality is for me. And the idea that there's nothing except matter and energy just seems really ludicrous to me. It doesn't make any sense. It seems illogical to me because I've just become so firmly seated in that traditional worldview. So, yeah, I wish I had some better stories about it, but
Well, Mike, I think that in a sense that, like, as a person, you've done 4,000 horror readings, and I've done, thousands of card readings for people. And I think, what my experience is that just the basis point of reality has kind of shifted, and I guess maybe what I'm looking for sometimes is the adrenaline hit of being really shocked. And maybe that's something you just sacrifice from being a practitioner. Things become, you take for granted the fact that you live, you're a beacon for coincidence. You're going to live in this place where these things simply happen, and what you're going to have to give up is the shock, but hopefully not the wonder.
I just analogize it to enlightenment experiences because, my teacher said, he wakes people up. He's like a Zen. He does that Zen pointing. And so he had some sort of explosive awakening experiences. And also he used to have that more with his people before. The problem that you have with that is that you mistake the fireworks for the reality. And then you start looking for the fireworks as opposed to abiding in the reality. So the thing with the magic is that, I've had some really interesting, like, for example, I made a talisman once that was, I thought, okay, Jupiter day, Jupiter hour, but it's Jupiter retrograde in detriment. I thought, just Jupiter hour, no big deal. I made it, and I immediately started losing money. It was ridiculous. I got this letter in the mail from the IRS saying, oh yeah, you remember those student loans you got forgiven like 6 months ago? Here's your income for that. You just realized $10,000 worth of income. That's a $3,000 additional tax bill. And then the next day I had something like that too. I was like, God, it was like every day I was getting hammered with this stuff. And so I deconsecrated the talismans, which I don't like to do. The other time with the Jupiter talisman, I made the Jupiter talisman. 45 minutes later, I go downstairs and there's a check for $3,000 in the mail. Now I'd done the work and put the bill in, but that's when it showed up. It was right after I did the ritual. So that stuff starts happening and you're like, oh, wow. And so that's what I would say about that sort of stuff. And the same thing with the invocation to physical appearance. It's like, I'm not going to believe in this unless it's completely like, you got to tie me down, and then like basically blow up this huge fireworks. So I'm not going to believe in it, and it's like, that doesn't, spiritual reality isn't, it doesn't necessarily manifest it. And you're better off in some ways if it doesn't, because if that's what you have to have, then maybe you'll never get that experience, but it's the fireworks. It's not the reality of it.
Right. Actually, just curious, what happened with that? I mean, the Jupiter talisman that you had to deconsecrate, what was the problem?
Well, I made it Jupiter day. I mean, it was Jupiter day, Jupiter hour, but Jupiter detriment retrograde.
Oh, Jupiter was in detriment and retrograde.
And retrograde.
Yeah. It
was awful. It was like I gave myself a curse. It was a financial curse talisman as opposed to being a positive, positive Jupiter talisman. It gave me all the negative effects of Jupiter. really quickly too.
Well, it gave you all the teaching effects too.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll never do that again. So that's one of those things. That's a wisdom through suffering sort of situation. Ouch. But you can look at that and say, oh, that's just a coincidence. That's just a coincidence. It's like the placebo effect. Once you label it, then you can put it away and you can forget about it. You don't have to worry about there's this huge hole in your worldview. Placebo effect is great because it's like, as Agrippa talks about that. He says, without the confidence in your physician, you can't heal anybody. Imagine if you could basically through trust heal 30% of the people that came in, or relieve the pain of 25% of the people. If you gave them the right colored pill and you did this whole setup with them, and all of a sudden there's no pain. Wow, that's incredibly powerful. But we can't do that because it's fake, it's placebo effects. Let's just forget about it and not even try because it doesn't fit with our chemical, view of how, the brain works, or, reality is material. It's amazing stuff that you're just putting aside because it doesn't fit into how the worldview. And that's what we're doing here, that you're recognizing, like the spells and everything you're doing. You're like, yeah, this works. You can see how it actually, you get to actually have the experience. Just like you said, that's a subjective experience. That's very powerful. That's ultimately what we have is our subjective experience. Everything is subjective.
Right.
From that immediate, experiential view.
You've got a question from Naya.
Part of fortune. Okay, it says, do you do anything with the part of fortune, part of traditional astrology? How would you work with the Arabic parts in general in terms of talismanic magic? For those that know the dot, can you explain the mansion of the moon and how we apply that in a practical way? Okay, part of fortune is, there's certain things that have a physical existence, like the planets. There's a planet out there, it's a physical planet. The nodes, for example, or the parts are mathematical relationships. And in fact, like the fixed stars, the way we use fixed stars in traditional astrology is a lot like a mathematical relationship because you're mapping the 360-degree globe onto a 2D map. So it doesn't exactly correspond to what you'd see if you went outside and looked out. So that freaks some people out. But again, it's mathematical correspondence. I haven't seen, the thing about the part of fortune is every chart's going to be different and it varies depending on what time. So, because what it is a relationship between the sun and the moon and the ascendant. So it would be, I suppose, it's just funky as far as, since every chart's different, I don't know how I deal with it. There isn't anything in our traditional sources with a part of fortune. And so you kind of have to do it yourself. And so it would be kind of a lifetime's work of kind of figuring out the part of fortune. But it sort of reminds me, people say, what about Pluto talismans? I'm like, go try it out. Tell me what happens. I mean, if your head blows up or something, I'd be interested to find out. I don't particularly want to do a Pluto talisman. But that's the thing is that, there's so much to work with. I mean, there's 7 planets. You've got all these 15 fixed stars. You got 36 decans. You got 28 mansions. Tremendous amount of stuff to work with and do all sorts of great stuff with. And so and like I said, in 20 years, I've done 1 extra fixed star. So I certainly wouldn't, it's got some interesting practical and philosophical problems, the parts. So I think that if someone really got inspired and got all sorts of, really felt like to moving, I wouldn't say it was wrong. It's just not in the tradition. We don't have anything to guide us. It's like not having a map. How do I get to this place? I don't have a map to get there. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist or you couldn't do it. It's just we don't have a map for that. Mansion of the Moon, those are really very incredibly important in magic. I mean, in fact, the mansions are probably most important for magical practice as opposed to predictive astrology in Western astrology. 28 mansions of the moon. The moon orbits the earth in about 27 and a half days. So Vedic, they have the 27 nakshatras, whereas in Arabic Western, they have 28. Both of them make sense. They're sort of like a lunar zodiac. And so each one has a different purpose for talismans, and it has a sign, image, and a mansion and incense and things like that. You can check that out on my page. If you just search Mansion of the Moon and get my Renaissance Astrology is pretty high on the organic Google search results. You can take a look at that. But those are talismans for the most part. I mean, when I've ever seen them for predictive astrology, there's just not much use of them. But the magical use is just tremendous. And one of the cool things for Arabic is there's 28 letters in the Arabic alphabet, and they do all sorts of Arabic letter magic. So it's really important in Arabic magic, the Mansions of the Moon. And I've been seeing that in the Shams al Marif and the talismans we're doing. Actually, we're going to do a 3rd mansion talisman coming up pretty soon. And so we'll have some really cool Arabic, Quranic, 3rd mansion stuff with that talisman. I'm really excited about that because Muhammad Ajmal, who's my jeweler, he's really knowledgeable about it. Not only is he a good astrologer and jeweler, but he's really knowledgeable about the Arabic magic and stuff. So that's been really cool to work with him. That's really an honor to have his collaboration on stuff and to be putting his talismans out. Let's see here. What is the original mythology behind the spirits and intelligence of the planets? Have they always been angelic? Is that a Christianization, Neoplatonic, Hermetic? I mean, you know, I think that, angel to me, not that I think it's, you know, I think that the angelic stuff, I like the word angel because it has such a positive connotation. And I do like to work with, you know, spirits that are positive. You could call them gods just as easily. I mean, I think that's just as fair, but it just gets people a little weirded out sometimes, you know, if they come up in a more Christian background, then it's just easier for people to handle calling them angels. I don't think it makes a huge difference to the spirits themselves. You know, it's just a different name for what I think is the same reality of it. I mean, you could think of, well, God made the world and he gave all these angels different jobs to do. And one of the jobs for the, you know, like the Jupiter, you know, these are really important celestial, you know, spirits, and they have certain jobs they have to do. It's like the, you know, the Gabriel blows the horn at the day of judgment, or the angel of death, or whatever. They all have different jobs, messengers, things like that.
Yeah, I'm really curious about like whether what exactly, how you would differentiate angels from demons in a real way, you know? I mean, because I almost think that it's almost just like different teams almost, because, you know, I remember listening to somebody talking about how they had been doing some Enochian work, and the angels made it very clear that they were displeased with the fact that he was working with goetic demons, right? You know?
Well, a couple things. The team thing I definitely get, because I do celestial magic, right? So I have to make sure if I'm doing anything else but see, you know, the Fatiha, you know, and the Hail Mary, no one's giving me any problem with that. The Buddhist stuff there, everyone's like, yeah, that's cool, right? The Lilith thing, though, again, I think it was a combination of the illness was that Lilith was just that way, to me at least, not to everybody, but to me, and that my guys didn't like me messing with that.
Yeah.
But see, the difference is, like, I do believe, I mean, this guy I was dealing with, the black magic guy, I would talk to him and we would both feel kind of sick.
Right.
Because the energy was so freaking incompatible. I'm so right-hand path. He really liked to talk to me because he was on a wisdom path. I mean, here's a guy into really heavy Kabbalistic, like the Klipoth and all that kind of stuff, you know, and the Lucifer stuff, and really deep left-hand magic, not just like messing around and like trying to, you know, steal money and, you know, get people to have sex with you. This is like the deepest, you know, it's even, like, it's hard to describe it as black magic, but it's, on the other hand, it's not anything I wouldn't have anything to do with. You know, he would tell me about, oh, I did this curse on somebody and I did all this stuff, which made sense to me, but it was like horrible stuff. You know, he's making people sick and putting them in the hospital and things like that. They irritated him. You know, the energy that you get from the angel is going to be different. I mean, the angelic stuff, often I feel very uplifted, and the effect on my life has been very positive, you know, and I don't have anyone saying, yeah, kill or whatever. They're not telling me to sacrifice chickens and not, you know what I mean? I don't have to make deals or anything like that. It's very positive. And so I do think that there's an energy field difference between, I mean, there's a difference between right and wrong. There's a difference between good and evil, you know? Ultimately, no, there's not. But you have to have a very, very high level of awareness to be at that level. And if you can see a difference in good and evil, then you'd be best to do good, unless you want the karmic. I mean, it's a karmic thing. You pay the price. And I do like the team thing, though. I think that's definitely true. But nevertheless, you know, I have to put a plug in for the right-hand path and say, you know, this is a safer, you know, there's not the blowback. When I don't have to do a magical circle. I don't bind spirits. I don't have to worry about that stuff. The most I have to do is I should start doing more of it, is clearing out before I start. Clear out all the, you know, do the 4 archangels, the directions, and purify the space. But I don't need to worry. Like if you call upon Saint Joseph, you don't have to worry about him blowing your head off. You don't have to confine it to a particular space and wear special clothing so you don't get the blowback from it, you know? Or I forget who it was an internet magician. He was talking about Bune, I think is how you pronounce it, Scoetic spirit for wealth. So he did an invocation of that spirit, asked for a specific sum of money. About a month or 2 later, his house burns down, and then he eventually gets an insurance check for that specific amount of money.
Right.
That's demonic. The angels will not mess with you that way. Of course, they won't give you what you want either. You could go ask for your 5,000, like, nah, we don't think you need the 5,000. You know, what you actually need is to be more generous, or we'll give you this, or whatever. That's the trade-off, is that you don't get what you want necessarily, but maybe I'm willing to trust them as far as giving me the right stuff. I mean, I look at my life, I'm like, I have this amazing life. I mean, I've been a professional astrologer for 20 years. I have a nice little middle-class life, and I haven't had a job for 25 years, you know? And I'm able to support myself and help people and sell people stuff that they like and do services for people that are helpful, you know, completely, basically, I think is the gift of the celestial spirits, you know, and a lot of hard work on my part. So that's what I put a plug in for. But you know what it is like, you know, quoting Jim Morrison, quoting William Blake, some are born to sweet delight and some are born to the endless night. You know, it's rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. I mean, your chart is your dharma. Your chart is your job. You're incarnated for these purposes. And so, you know, that if you can't be who you are, that's the biggest tragedy. You know, it's like putting a hawk in a cage. You know, and that's sad when you see people, they get stuck in conventional reality. But people here, I'm sure they're freaking freely. You know, you wouldn't be here if you weren't. So that's what's really cool, is that you're able to, you know, we can coexist with the greater society in a relatively positive way, but we don't have to be controlled by it. You know, we can go and think how we want, believe how we want, act how we want, and in a positive way, you know, without being rebels or criminals necessarily. And I think that's really cool. That's what I like about mine. For me, the magical stuff, I know people that are like, they're totally conventional except for like they do magic or astrology, but the rest is, but for me, it blew up my life. I mean, I couldn't see anything the same after I recognized that astrology worked, you know, and magic worked. It had a revolutionary effect on my entire life. And that's probably the most beneficial effect, more than the stuff and the magic and getting the material effects, is that it just changed me and really put me on this, you know, much more a spiritual path that I'm continuing to follow to this day. So that's my pitch. Some people like it and some people, you know, some people are less, you know, they have their own, everyone has their own thing. So let's see here. Okay, 258. So we're hit the end point, and so we had 18 people, you know, go through. That was pretty good. Lasted out the whole time. I want to thank everybody for the opportunity. This is a new thing for me. I haven't been a host before on Zoom, and recording. I think I got the recording. Hopefully that'll work. And I'll talk to Darren about getting that, see if it worked, and making that available to everybody. But I want to thank everybody for coming. I obviously had a great time because I got to talk a lot, but I just really enjoy the interaction with all, you know, with you guys, being able to have a chance to talk to you. Susie, was awesome to be able to have a back and forth, and you really enrich things tremendously. I'm so happy that you're here today. And I just think it's great that you guys are doing what you do, and thank you so much for being here today and sharing it with me.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Susie, for keeping the questions coming, and we'll do this again really soon, I hope.
Awesome. I'd love to come back.